At 20, Hattie Greer was homeless, half-starved, and carrying the last $5.40 she owned in the pocket of her father's old coat, because Silas Brandt had turned her out of her own cabin after calling in a debt her dead father could no longer argue with, and because she had refused, in front of his polished desk and his watch chain and his thin smile, to sign away the little scrap of family claim attached to her mother's name. With $4 of that money, on a wind-blown afternoon in Cedar Ridge, Colorado, in the fall of 1898, she did the one thing that made the town laugh outright. She bought the forgotten forge at the edge of Mill Creek Road, the soot-dark, half-collapsed blacksmith shop everyone else had already decided was fit only for rats, splinters, and winter ruin. It was a desperate purchase, and a foolish one by every practical measure available to a hungry girl standing alone among men who still believed a woman could inherit exhaustion but not destiny. Yet hidden behind the dead bellows of that old forge was a leather ledger no one had seen in 16 years, and inside that ledger was a name written carefully enough to survive dust, greed, and silence. A name that would change Hattie's future forever and force an entire town to remember who it belonged to before fear taught it how to bow. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Hattie Greer. If you are listening from a place where people have mistaken neglect for worthlessness, tell us in the comments. Cedar Ridge had been built where the red earth rose into iron-colored hills, and a narrow creek ran cold in the spring, before shrinking to a ribbon by late summer. And in the years of Hattie's childhood, it still believed itself destined for more than weather and memory. Freight wagons came in from Pueblo with flour and kerosene and bolts of blue calico, or carts rattled down from the old silver diggings above town, and the broad boardwalk in front of Brandt Mercantile carried a steady sound of boots, spurs, and talk. There was a church with peeling white paint, a schoolhouse with 2 tall windows facing east, a livery stable, a boarding house, a row of cottages tucked under cottonwoods, and near the bend in Mill Creek Road, where the smell of coal smoke used to mingle with wet clay after rain, there stood Doan's Forge, hot-hearted and useful from dawn until the lamplight hour. Hattie grew up inside the sound of hammer blows the way other children grew up inside hymn singing. Her father, Jonas Greer, was not the blacksmith who owned the forge, though he worked beside that anvil often enough that the townsfolk sometimes spoke of the place as if it belonged to both men. The forge itself had been built and kept by Ansel Doan, a widower with a left hand thickened by old burns, and a voice so quiet that people had to lean in when he spoke, which made them listen better than they otherwise would have. Jonas was a wheelwright and repairman, the kind of steady craftsman who could look at a cracked wagon tongue, a loose rim, a sprung axle, or a splintered gate, and see not what had failed, but what shape would make it useful again. Between Jonas at his shaving horse and Ansel at the coals, the little shop on Mill Creek Road served half the county. Horses were shod there, hinges forged, plowshares drawn out and hammered straight, stove doors mended, branding irons lettered, chain links repaired, and sometimes, when weather or bad luck had stripped a family close to the bone, the men would patch a kettle or fix a broken harness buckle without asking for payment until after the harvest, or not asking for it at all. Hattie's mother, Lena Greer, had once been Lena Brandt, though in Cedar Ridge that fact was treated less as family history than as a sort of cautionary myth, recited with lowered voices and never in front of Silas Brandt if a person wished to keep buying flour on credit. Lena had been the daughter of Elias Brandt, who in the oldest stories was remembered as the hard-driving founder of Cedar Ridge, a man who came west with surveying tools, a water engineer's eye, and enough stubbornness to imagine a town where most people saw only creekstone and scrub. By the time Hattie was born, Elias was already dead, and what remained of him in daily life was not affection, but ownership. His nephew Silas held the banknote files, the mercantile accounts, the water contracts for the irrigation ditch above town, and the air of a man who believed Providence had arranged itself in ledgers for his convenience. Lena almost never spoke of her father's house on the hill, or the quarrel that followed when she married Jonas instead of the lawyer from Denver someone had picked out for her. She would only say, when Hattie was old enough to hear the ache beneath restraint, that there were some homes too proud to keep love if love arrived wearing work boots. What Lena did speak of, and speak of often, were the habits she hoped would outlast circumstance. She taught Hattie to read by firelight from Scripture, seed catalogs, and old newspapers saved in a trunk, and she taught her to keep numbers clean and honest on a page. She taught her how to turn a worn collar and reline a coat cuff, how to stretch soup when company arrived unexpectedly, how to fold grief into labor without becoming bitter toward either. A person can lose comfort and still keep her shape, she used to say as she kneaded bread on the flour-scored table. That is the part no one can seize unless you help them. Jonas taught Hattie with his hands more than his voice. From him she learned the grain of hickory, the patience of fitting iron to wood, the old trick of testing a weak board by sound instead of sight, and the discipline of doing a job properly even if no one likely to pay you would notice the difference. Ansel Doane added a third education, quieter than the other two, but no less lasting. He let Hattie work the bellows when she was only 8 years old, her braid down her back, and her shoes white with road dust, and he showed her how fire changed under attention. Metal remembers the heat that shaped it. He told her one amber evening while sparks lifted like insects toward the rafters. People do too. Best be careful what kind you give them. So Hattie grew not fragile but observant, not loud but impossible to fool for long. She knew the smell of mule sweat in summer harness, the bitter clean scent of wet iron plunged into the trough, the sweetish odor of split pine, the dry taste of wind before snow. She knew how Cedar Ridge sounded when it was well, and how it sounded when worry moved through it. In good months the town rang. In lean ones, it creaked. People came to rely on the Greers and on old Ansel in 100 ways that do not make history books, but do make a settlement human. Hattie carried repaired hinges back to Mrs. Treadwell's boarding house, took account slips from Ansel to the mercantile, read letters aloud to Mrs. Salazar when her eyes watered too badly for her to make out script, and sat with her mother on church steps while Lena handed biscuits wrapped in clean cloth to children whose fathers had not yet found steady work. Nobody then would have called the Greers important, which is another way of saying they were woven so thoroughly into daily kindness that folks stopped naming it. The first loss came when Hattie was 14, and a fever took Lena in 3 cold days at the tail end of March, just when the creek had begun to run fuller and everyone had started speaking as if winter had finally spent itself. Grief does strange work in a small house. It does not always announce itself with shattering. Sometimes it simply removes a voice and lets every object ring around the absence. Jonas worked longer after that. Hattie learned to cook what her mother had made look effortless. She washed, patched, hauled, copied sums, and spent more hours at the forge where labor at least had shape. Ansel, who had buried his own sorrow years earlier and carried it with the care of a man transporting hot iron, did not offer speeches. He only made room for her to stand near the anvil and handed her tasks that mattered. By 16 she could sharpen a plow point, true a bent strap hinge, draft a straight invoice, and detect from the set of a customer's shoulders whether he wanted practical help or merely the dignity of being spoken to, as though his troubles were not obvious to everyone. Cedar Ridge admired usefulness in the abstract, but it still had its old habits about women and property and public voice. Hattie learned to move inside those habits without surrendering to them. She could laugh when required, keep still when silence served her better, and yet hold an opinion within herself like a banked coal. Ansel once told Jonas, not knowing Hattie could hear from the back room, "That girl has a mind like a square nail, uncommon, but it holds." Jonas chuckled, and Hattie stored the remark in the place where a young person keeps the first true measurement of herself. The town changed as she changed. Silver had begun to disappoint the hills. One mine flooded, another pinched ore, a third shut down entirely after a cave-in no one spoke of without removing his hat. Wagons came through less often. Families left by increments, which is how frontier places unravel, not all at once but one porch at a time. Silas Brandt, meanwhile, grew smoother. He had inherited not just mercantile stock and account books, but his uncle Elias's ditch shares, the warehouse lots, and the persuasive force of being the man people needed when cash ran thin in January. He lent on land, tools, seed, cattle, and hope. He did it in a tone so calm that debt sometimes sounded, for the first week or two, like relief. Hattie never liked him. She did not like the way he asked questions as if answers were already his. She did not like the little pause he used before saying a person's name, as though evaluating how much of their hunger he might eventually own. Lena had taught her never to let bitterness arrange her face, but she had not forbidden discernment. Then, in the summer Hattie turned 19, Ansel Doane died in his sleep in the narrow room behind the forge. He had gone gray and spare as fence wire in his last years, but until the end there had remained about him the feeling of something essential and enduring, like the creek bed itself or the chapel bell. His death closed more than a life. It closed a center of gravity. The forge, without Ansel's hands, and with Jonas already burdened by too little work, did not keep on. There was no money to buy his tools outright, no son coming back from elsewhere to continue the trade, and no investor interested in a smoke-black shop at the edge of a shrinking town. The county posted notices about back taxes. The bellows fell silent. Dust gathered on the window ledge. Boys threw pebbles at the chimney for sport. By winter, people no longer said Doane's Forge unless they were giving directions. They called it the Old Forge, then the Dead Forge, and finally the Forgotten Forge, which is what places become once memory is too embarrassed by usefulness gone poor. Jonas kept working from a lean shed beside their cabin as best he could, repairing wagon wheels and gate frames for ranchers who now paid mostly in promises. Hattie helped him. Together they might have endured if hardship had been content to arrive in only one shape at a time, but it rarely is. The winter after Ansel died was dry and mean. The spring that followed came late, and Silas Brandt raised water rates on the ditch shares, feeding the lower gardens and stock troughs. People grumbled. Silas spoke of maintenance. Hattie watched Mrs. Salazar carry wash water twice as far because she had let one contract lapse. She watched children fill pails from the creek's silty edge instead of the cleaner flow above town. She watched Jonas sit longer at the table after supper, cap in his hands, reading over figures that never improved by rereading. The Greers owed on their cabin roof and workshop shed. It had once been a manageable note. Under Silas Brandt's revisions and fees, it became a tightening rope. Jonas was proud, but not foolish. He went to Brandt's office twice and came home both times with the same shuttered expression Hattie had seen in men leaving the dentist or the undertaker. The second time he told her, while pretending to adjust a spoke shave that needed no adjusting, that Silas had offered to restructure the debt if Hattie would enter service at the Brant house as companion to Silas's sister Eunice, and if the Greers would sign a broad quitclaim on any dormant family interest through the maternal line. A phrase so oddly dressed and needless that Hattie felt at once the old alertness her mother had planted in her. "What interest?" she asked. Jonas shook his head. "Likely none. That is what makes it stink." He refused the offer. Hattie thanked him for it with her eyes, because there are some dignities daughters are too full to speak. By late summer, Jonas's cough had worsened from long years of dust and cold starts. Then came the accident. A team from Wilcox Ranch spooked at Thunder and snapped a front axle near the bridge. Jonas ran to help before the wagon pitched into the ditch, got the children clear, and took the brunt of the wheel when it collapsed. He lived 3 days after that, enough to suffer, enough to apologize for leaving Hattie with so little nailed down, enough to grip her hand hard once and say, with the old craftsman's certainty even through pain, "Never sign what you're rushed to sign, and never believe a man who calls a thing worthless while he is trying to buy it." He died before dawn, while the lamp smoked low, and rain moved over the roof in small, exhausted taps. After the burial, Cedar Ridge became for Hattie what it becomes for many who have just lost the last person fully bound to them, the same place, and not the same place at all. Every board in the cabin still knew her. Every cup had been lifted by familiar hands, yet nothing in the room any longer stood between her and the appetite of the world. She tried at first to keep afloat with work. She took in mending, helped Mrs. Treadwell with laundry, copied inventories for the school board, and even shod 2 old mares at the Salazar place, because necessity will teach the hand what convention forbids. But grief and debt had become linked around her, and Silas Brant did not permit time when time no longer served him. He sent notice that the loan, revised after Jonas's death, would be called in full unless the property transferred. Hattie asked to see the books. He let her, smiling. The columns were precise, the penalties legal, the defeat nearly complete. Again, he placed before her a paper renouncing any claim through her mother's line to certain Brant properties still under dispute in family recollection only. Again he offered mercy in exchange for surrender of what, if it was truly nothing, should not have required surrender at all. Hattie did what hungry people do when pride is no longer an affordable performance. She read every line. She asked for a day. Silas gave her an hour. She refused him then, not because she knew what the maternal claim meant, but because her mother and father had both warned her in different language against the same species of trap. Silas's face remained courteous, but his eyes cooled into something almost relieved, as though her refusal freed him to enjoy what came next. Within the week the cabin was posted. The shed tools were listed for sale. Mrs. Treadwell let Hattie keep a narrow bed under the boarding house eaves for 3 nights, then confessed with tears in her voice that her own credit at Brant Mercantile would be cut if she continued harboring trouble. Hattie gathered what was hers, a blanket, her parents' Bible, Jonas's coat, a small iron kettle, a sewing box, Lena's thimble, and the $5.40 she had hidden in a coffee tin beneath the stove brick. That sum, which once might have seemed laughably small beside a life, was now everything. It is not always cruelty that strips a person to the bone. Sometimes it is the tidiness of other people protecting themselves. Hattie spent one night in the livery loft with old hay in her hair, one beneath the schoolhouse porch wrapped in the horse blanket Mrs. Salazar pretended not to have left there, and another in the church shed, where the scent of candle wax and mildewed hymnals did little to soften the knowledge that morning would come and she would still have nowhere proper to go. People nodded to her with shame-faced kindness and then turned to their own errands. They were not monsters. They were indebted. In places like Cedar Ridge, dependency can make decent people behave with a cowardice they would not recognize in a stronger season. On the 4th day of her homelessness, the county held a tax and salvage sale in front of the old warehouse. Hattie had no intention of buying anything. She went because public sales gather scraps, and scraps sometimes sell cheaply enough to become supper in another form later on. Men came for mule harness, rusted picks, broken bedsteads, a stack of warped doors, 2 cracked water barrels, and a heap of fittings from the shuttered ore works. Near the end, with impatience already creeping into the auctioneer's voice, they brought up the forgotten forge lot, the shop building, chimney, remaining fixtures, and attached yard, sold as is for taxes owing on the Doan estate. Laughter moved through the crowd even before the bidding opened. The roof sagged. One shutter hung by a single hinge. The bellows had long since split and gone stiff. Everybody knew the place was one hard winter from surrendering outright. The auctioneer started at $10, dropped to $8, then $6. No one lifted a hand. A boy called out that he would give a nickel for the nails if the county knocked the rest down for kindling. Even the auctioneer smiled. Hattie, standing at the edge in Jonas's coat with dust on her hem, felt something inside her sharpen. Shelter was shelter. A forge had walls, a stove base, workbenches, and a door that once had closed well. More than that, it had memory. She had grown inside that sound. Ansel's bench still stood in her mind the way a house stands after a fire in the people who loved it. Before caution could finish its case, she heard her own voice say, $4. Heads turned, men blinked and then grinned. Someone muttered that the Greer girl had bought herself a soot coffin. Someone else asked if she planned to marry a horseshoe. The auctioneer, glad merely to be rid of the lot, called once, twice, and struck the crate with his mallet. Just like that, for $4, Hattie owned the most mocked building in Cedar Ridge and 40 cents more than no roof at all. The forge looked worse from up close. The front threshold had rotted along one side. The windows were veiled with grit. Ash lay thick in the firebox. The room smelled of old charcoal, mouse nests, damp leather, rust, and the particular dry sadness of tools left too long without hands. Yet when Hattie pushed the swollen door inward, and sunlight entered in one slanting blade across the dirt-dark floorboards, she did not feel foolish. She felt, for the first time in days, bordered. The anvil still stood squat and trustworthy on its block. The quench trough was cracked but upright. Pegs lined the wall where tongs had once hung in useful rows. In the back room she found a narrow cot frame, 2 coal scuttles, a box of bent nails, 3 sound bricks, and a shelf of account slips fused together by damp. She spent that whole afternoon clearing trash, sweeping, propping open the window, and prying loose the boards that had warped inward around the lower door. When evening fell, the forge still looked poor, but it looked inhabited again, and there are forms of hope that begin no grander than that. The first night she slept there, wind worked through the chimney throat and made a low hollow sound like breathing. Hattie lay awake under her blanket staring at the rafters, listening to loose tin tick and settle, and thought of her father's rule about broken things. If one piece seems wrong, look to the joint beside it. The next day she set about inspecting the place as he would have done, not sentimentally but practically. She checked the sill rot, tapped the bench legs, sorted scrap iron from salvageable iron, and pulled the old bellows frame away from the wall far enough to sweep behind it. That was when she noticed the leather. At first it seemed only a flap of ruined harness lodged in the narrow space between the bellows casing and the plank wall. She reached in to tug it free, expecting rot. Instead, her fingers closed around something thicker, stiff but whole, tucked flat inside a shallow cavity hidden by the bellows board. Dust fell over her sleeve as she worked it loose. What came out was a ledger no larger than a family Bible, bound in cracked brown leather gone almost black with soot, the edges of its pages rough and sealed by years. On its cover, faint beneath grime, Ansel Doane had once pressed his initials with a stamp. Hattie stood holding it while the late light moved across the forge floor, and a strange stillness gathered around her, the kind that belongs to old rooms when they are about to surrender what they have kept. Most of the ledger was exactly what it seemed at first: entries for shoeing teams, repairing wagon tires, fitting stoveplates, sharpening drills, settling accounts in cash or eggs or half-loads of coal. It was Cedar Ridge in miniature, written in the firm. Spare hand Hattie remembered from the slips Ansel used to send with finished work. Mr. Salazar, 3 trace hooks. Mrs. Treadwell, hinge strap, no charge. School stove grate, patch, town account. But about 2/3 of the way through, the pattern altered. Several pages had been carefully pasted together along the outer edge, and one had begun to lift where age dried the glue. Hattie eased the leaves apart with her mother's thimble and a damp fingertip. Between them lay a second set of notes in smaller writing, hidden on paper that had never been meant for casual eyes. The first sentence brought the blood up into her face so quickly she had to sit down on Ansel's old stool. If this ledger is found after my death, let it be known that I hid it, because Mr. Silas Brandt sought the destruction of the paper naming the true heir to Elias Brandt's holdings, and because I would not see the town bent forever around one man's lie. Hattie read on in a kind of widening disbelief. Ansel wrote that in the final month of Elias Brandt's life, after a sickness and a quarrel with his own conscience had softened him, he had executed a private codicil before witnesses acknowledging his estranged daughter Lena as lawful heir to the Brandt water rights, the foundry parcels, the warehouse lots by the creek, and the controlling shares in Cedar Ridge Ditch and Supply. If Lena should predecease him, then all such rights were to pass to her child, named here in full as Harriet Lenora Greer, born July 9, 1878. Hattie's own name looked back at her from the soot-stained page with a calm that felt almost impossible. The entry did not stop there. Ansel, acting as witness and temporary recorder because the county clerk was snowed out that week, wrote that he copied the codicil into his daybook after Elias feared his nephew would suppress it. He noted the names of the other 2 witnesses, one already dead and the other, Mrs. Beatrice Wynne, former midwife, living now in a shack beyond the lower ridge. He recorded the seal Elias had used, a brass signet with a split cedar tree on its face, and he added one final line, harder pressed than the rest. Silas took the original packet the morning after the old man died. But he does not know I marked the iron chest and kept this account, nor that the deeds to the common water parcels were not in the packet he stole. Hattie turned the page with shaking hands. There, in the back margin, Ansel had drawn a simple diagram of the forge wall and written, "Behind the east bellows only this book. For the deeds, ask where the church keeps what it no longer rings." The forge around her seemed suddenly crowded with years that were not gone at all, only withheld. She thought of her mother's silence, of Jonas refusing that strange quitclaim, of Silas calling a maternal claim worthless while insisting she sign it away. She thought of the house on the hill she had never entered, the surname spoken carefully in town, the look in Silas's eyes every time he met hers, as if checking whether inheritance had somehow taught itself to stand upright in rough clothing. And threaded through all of it, more painful than astonishment, because it touched the living center of what had been denied, came the knowledge that her mother had not only been loved somewhere once, not only remembered, but restored in writing before death closed the chance to say it aloud. Hattie did not sleep much that night. She read the hidden pages until candle wax guttered down the saucer. She copied the key passages onto scrap paper from an old feed invoice, because if hardship had taught her one thing beyond endurance, it was this: truth should never live in only one place if someone powerful wants it gone. At dawn she wrapped the ledger in Jonas's oilcloth tulle apron and carried it first to Mrs. Salazar, whose discretion was as solid as her bread, and then by a longer road to Miss Prudence Hale, the schoolteacher, who had taught Hattie penmanship and retained a stubborn respect for exact language. Miss Hale read the copied lines twice, removed her spectacles, and said in a voice that had turned unexpectedly young with alarm, "My dear girl, if this is genuine, Silas Brant has been sitting in another person's chair for near 16 years. Hattie answered, "Then we ought not leave him time to grow roots in it." The next step lay with Beatrice Wynne, the old midwife Ansel had named. Hattie found her at the far edge of town, in a cabin smelling of sage, lamp oil, and old apples, wrapped in shawls, though the day was not cold. Mrs. Wynne's hearing had faded, but not her memory. At the mention of Elias Brant and Lena, her clouded eyes sharpened. "I signed it," she said before Hattie had finished explaining. "I signed because the old man wept, and because men who delay justice till death are poor creatures, but they are still sometimes better at the end than in the middle. Silas came after, wanting to know what his uncle had done. I told him not enough and too late. He said no paper would stand that wasn't filed proper. I told him conscience does not ask the courthouse for permission." From a cedar box beneath her bed she produced a brittle card on which her own name appeared beside Ansel Doane's in faded ink, a memorandum of witness meant, perhaps, to remind herself that the event had happened exactly as she remembered it. Hattie held that little card as if it had warmth, but law, as Hattie knew from watching Silas prosper under it, often required more than truth and memory. The ledger named her, yes, it named the inheritance and the theft of the original codicil. Yet Ansel's note about the deeds tugged at her harder the longer she considered it. "Ask where the church keeps what it no longer rings." Miss Hale puzzled over the phrase with her until evening, when the answer came not like thunder, but like common sense returning after a nap. The church had once kept its cracked second bell, removed years earlier when the rope split and the frame warped. It had not been discarded. Old things too heavy to throw away often ended up in the church cellar or loft, stored in sanctified neglect. If Elias Brant's common water deeds had been hidden where the church keeps what it no longer rings, then the bell itself, or the place where the bell had been stowed, might hold the rest of the proof. By then, though, word had begun to move. A town cannot watch a homeless girl by a dead forge, see her go in and out of the schoolhouse and the midwife's shack with papers under her arm, and fail to invent explanations. Some said she had found gold in the wall. Some said Ansel had left her a hoard. Some said she had taken to reading omens in soot. Silas Brant heard something close enough to truth to trouble him, because the very next morning he sent his clerk with a notice claiming the forge sale had been administratively irregular and that occupancy was contingent pending review. It was an elegant threat, the sort designed not to win in court, but to unnerve before court could begin. Hattie nailed the notice to the inside of the forge door instead of obeying it. Then she copied the ledger pages again and hid the original inside the stove base beneath a loose firebrick. That evening she and Miss Hale went to the church under the plain excuse of sorting donation bins for the harvest fair. Pastor Webb, who disliked conflict but hated deceit even more, let them into the cellar with a lantern. There, among broken candlesticks, cracked school slates, moth-nibbled altar cloths, and a dismantled harmonium, lay the old bronze bell on its side, like something that had once believed in being heard. Beneath the bell's wooden yoke was a small iron chest dark with age and coal dust, its lid marked on the corner by a smith's chisel stroke, in the shape of a cedar split down the center. Hattie's breath caught. Ansel had marked the chest. Silas had not known. The chest was locked, but old iron often yields to old skill. Hattie took it back to the forge wrapped in a quilt and worked at the corroded latch with thin tools from Jonas's box until near midnight, when it gave with a sigh rather than a snap. Inside lay 3 documents sealed in oilskin, 2 ditch share certificates, an original survey of Cedar Ridge's upper water run, and a letter from Elias Brandt in his own hand. In it he admitted, with the grave economy of men near the edge of time, that his treatment of Lena had been an offense against both fatherhood and God, that his nephew Silas had mistaken temporary management for rightful succession, and that the upper ditch, lower foundry lots, and warehouse parcels nearest Mill Creek were to be preserved under the control of Lena or her issue for the continued benefit of Cedar Ridge, and not for extortion by private toll. The phrase was so exact, so severe, that Hattie almost smiled through her tears. Even dying, Elias Brandt had known precisely what kind of man he had allowed to flourish under his roof. Now the mystery was no longer whether Hattie had found something real, but how far that reality reached. The survey showed that the upper ditch shares Silas had been selling and reselling, as if they were his by right, were in fact tied to the foundry parcels and the common forge easement. The warehouse lots, long rumored to be worthless, controlled the wagon approach to the lower market ground. The dead forge itself, mocked for years, sat at the hinge point between those holdings. Whoever lawfully held the old Brandt industrial parcels could lower water tolls, reopen the market sheds, and determine whether Cedar Ridge remained a company town in all but name, or returned to being a place where people might breathe without asking permission. Hattie had expected perhaps a family wound, perhaps a house, perhaps a sum. She had not expected a civic spine disguised as ruin. Silas Brandt, however, was not a man to surrender, because a poor girl had become inconveniently documented. When Hattie presented herself at his office with copies of the ledger entry, Beatrice Wynn's witness card, and the survey note, he did not bluster. He smiled. That made him more dangerous. He looked over the pages, tapped one with his fingernail, and said that grief had made her susceptible to fantasies. He said Ansel Doane had been a blacksmith, not an attorney. He said old men wrote sentimental nonsense on deathbeds, and county title stood where county title had stood for years. Then, in a gesture more insulting than any shout could have been, he drew open the side drawer of his desk and laid $25 upon the green blotter. "Take this," he said. "Leave town on tomorrow's coach, and let us spare one another an ugly public embarrassment." Hattie looked at the money, at his cufflinks, at the glass-fronted cabinet behind him where ledgers stood in rows like obedient witnesses, and understood something with a calmness that surprised her. He was afraid. Not of scandal alone, nor of legal expense, but of the older thing money cannot easily purchase back once lost: precedence. If a homeless girl in a dead blacksmith shop could pull one true page from soot and make him answer to it, then perhaps the town's obedience had never been as natural as he liked to imagine. "You should keep it," she said quietly. "You may need it for your own fare." That was when the velvet came off his voice. He told her she would be sorry. He told her no jury in the county would prefer a pasted secret in a blacksmith's book to 16 years of established management. He told her people who depended on his store would not thank her for stirring old grief into fresh hunger. Most telling of all, he told her that Cedar Ridge was orderly because certain people knew when they were unfit to govern it. Hattie left without answering. Outside, the wind had risen and blown a line of yellow leaves against the boardwalk. She gathered them with her eyes the way some people gather courage with attention to small things, staying where they are supposed to be. The opposition came at once, and from several directions. First, there were whispers that Hattie meant to seize the water ditch and charge double, that she had forged her mother's name, that Beatrice Wynne was senile, that Miss Hale had coached the story for entertainment in a dull autumn. Then came official inconvenience. The county assessor sent a man to revalue the forge. The bank clerk informed Mrs. Salazar that her flower extension might not be renewed if she continued associating her house with contentious claims. Pastor Webb received a letter suggesting the church could face scrutiny over tax exemptions if he involved himself in private inheritance disputes. Even the livery owner, good-hearted Mr. Dobbs, advised Hattie in a low voice to take the decent offer and start clean somewhere with trees. It was the old Western bargain between power and exhaustion, not open violence, but pressure applied precisely where daily life is already tender. For one long day the town seemed to lean away from her. Children were called back from the forge door. Women who had borrowed thread from Lena once now nodded from a distance instead of stepping close. Hattie kept cleaning, repairing, and copying papers at the bench, as if labor itself could brace the walls. Still, loneliness has a way of making boards creak louder at night. She sat beside the cold firebox after dark, the leather ledger open across her knees, and let herself feel for a few minutes the full weight of how little stood between truth and defeat if people decided convenience mattered more than fairness. She thought of her mother carrying the Brandt name quietly enough that it had never protected her. She thought of Jonas dying, worried for what he could not nail down. She thought, too, of Ansel taking time in his last years to paste pages together and hide them behind dead bellows because some part of him trusted a future he himself would not see. That trust felt like a hand on her shoulder. She rose before dawn with the steadier heart that comes after a person has cried privately and chosen not to be ashamed of it. The turn began with the smallest courage. Mrs. Salazar came first, bringing a loaf still warm and a sack of beans. She set them on the workbench and said, in the practical tone some women use to disguise loyalty, "If there is to be a fight, it should not be fought hungry." After her came Pastor Webb with the church records, showing the bell's storage date and the inventory chest listed under retained property, not for discard. Miss Hale arrived carrying the school register from Hattie's birth year, where Lena Greer had signed her daughter's name in a hand that matched the letter, sealed in the iron chest. By afternoon, old Mr. Dobbs sent over a wagon cover to patch the forge roof, perhaps too embarrassed by his own caution to do more than that, but doing it anyway. Then Beatrice Wynne, who had not walked into town proper in months, had herself brought by mule cart to sit in the forge doorway and tell anyone who cared to listen that she had watched Elias Brandt cry over the paper Silas now called imaginary. There are moments when a frightened town remembers itself, not by speeches, but by who shows up first with bread, paper, and witness. Silas answered by announcing a public review before the county magistrate, who was due through Cedar Ridge in 3 days to inspect bridge levees. He meant it as spectacle and containment, a way to bring the matter under forms he believed he controlled. Had he accepted at once, which unsettled him more than refusal might have done. Then, as if urgency had finally stripped his caution, he made his most dangerous move. The night before the hearing, someone broke into the forge. Hattie was sleeping in the back room when the front latch lifted. She woke not to footsteps, but to the wrong kind of silence. The silence of a room listening to someone who does not belong in it. Through the cracked partition she saw lantern light slide over the anvil and bench. A man was moving carefully along the wall where the bellows stood. Another waited near the door. Hattie did not scream. She slipped through the rear window, ran barefoot across the cold yard to Mr. Dobbs's stable, and came back with him, his son, and half the neighborhood roused by shouts. The men inside escaped through the front and vanished into cottonwoods before anyone saw faces clearly, but they had not found the ledger. Hattie had moved it that evening into the hollow under the anvil block, wrapped in oilcloth and ash. What they did leave behind was nearly as useful, a dropped brass collar stud engraved with a tiny bee. Silas's clerks all wore identical sets on Sundays. By morning, Cedar Ridge was no longer neutral. Even those who disliked disturbance could understand a burglary better than an inheritance dispute. It was visible. It had splintered the latch and overturned the bench. It had exposed fear on the wrong side of the argument. When Silas heard that the thieves had failed, and that his clerk Edwin Vale had been seen without one brass stud at breakfast, his composure thinned. He sent a message denying any involvement and calling the accusation slanderous. Hattie did not accuse publicly. She merely placed the engraved stud in a jar on the forge shelf, where everyone coming to offer help could see it and draw conclusions without assistance. The hearing took place in the church because it was the only room large enough to hold both the curious and the anxious. Magistrate Owen Keene arrived with dust on his boots, and a face that suggested boredom had long ago become his occupational posture. Silas sat in the front pew with his attorney from the county seat. Hattie sat 2 rows back in Lena's old dark dress, mended at the cuffs, with Miss Hale on one side and Pastor Webb on the other. The leather ledger lay wrapped in clean cloth on her lap. Outside, wagons lined the road. Inside, the whole town seemed to breathe through cloth. Silas's attorney argued first. He spoke of continuity of title, unfiled family sentiments, the inadmissibility of private diary matter, and the danger of allowing commerce to be disrupted by romantic reinterpretations of settled inheritance. He suggested the Brant management had preserved Cedar Ridge through difficult years, and that the claimant, recently dispossessed and lacking stable means, might be acting under emotional strain. It was a polished speech, and for a few minutes we could feel the old machinery trying to resume its proper hum, the one in which poor people's facts are always somehow made to sound less factual because their shoes are worn. Then Hattie stood. She did not speak like a lawyer, because she was not one. She spoke like a woman raised among tools that either fit or failed. She laid the ledger on the table, opened to the hidden pages. She submitted the iron chest documents, the church inventory, the witness memorandum, the school register, and the survey map showing the upper ditch and foundry parcels bound together by original grant. She called Beatrice Wynne, whose voice shook only once, and Miss Hale. whose testimony about handwriting and dates was as crisp as frost. She spoke of the attempted purchase of her silence, of the quitclaim Silas had pressed on her before she knew what it concerned, and of the burglary. She did not thunder, she did not plead. She simply aligned piece to piece until the pattern became too plain for even boredom to dismiss. What broke the matter open finally was not Hattie's anger, though she had earned some, but Pastor Webb's submission of a letter he had received months earlier from Silas, requesting access to old church storage in search of irrelevant family relics that may provoke confusion if mishandled. Silas had forgotten the letter, or perhaps he had counted on no minister wanting trouble badly enough to produce it. Magistrate Keene read it twice, then asked the question that should have been asked years earlier. If these supposed relics were irrelevant, why had Mr. Brandt sought them in secret before any public claim arose? Silas answered too quickly, then too sharply, then with the unmistakable irritation of a man unused to discovering that other people have been collecting his contradictions. The magistrate did not settle the entire estate that day, but he did what mattered first. He issued an immediate injunction preventing Silas Brandt from transferring, taxing, or collecting private tolls upon the disputed Upper Ditch and Foundry parcels until a county adjudication could be completed. He recognized the ledger and supporting documents as sufficient cause for formal review of title. Most importantly, he appointed temporary custodianship of the forge and connected property records to Hattie Greer as named claimant, pending final order. The church did not erupt. Cedar Ridge was not that sort of place. But the sound that moved through the room then, low and rough and almost reverent, was the sound of restraint giving way to relief. Final judgment took 6 more weeks, because truth often walks slower than deceit. Yet once the matter reached the county seat with testimony sworn and seals examined, the rest followed with the inevitability of thaw. Elias Brandt's handwriting was authenticated against older deeds. The signet matched wax impressions on filed plats. The survey proved the Upper Ditch, Lower Market sheds, foundry parcels, and forge easement had been bundled in the original development grant, and could not have lawfully passed into Silas's sole ownership under the terms he claimed. When the court issued its final order, it named Harriet Lenora Greer, only surviving child of Lena Brandt Greer, as rightful heir to the Brandt industrial and water holdings described in the codicil, with the explicit obligation, inherited alongside them, to preserve common access where Elias had so directed. The phrase felt less like wealth than like a charge laid across generations and finally reaching the right shoulders. Hattie could have done many things then. She could have sold the parcels to outside interests and vanished east on a train wearing a hat with new ribbon. She could have moved into the big Brandt house and learned to speak through servants. She could have charged back rent, water fees, and storage to every man who had looked away while she slept under porches. Cedar Ridge, to its credit and its shame, would have understood if she had chosen some private satisfaction. But old teachings survive. Hattie remembered her mother dividing biscuits, her father repairing tools for men who paid late, Ansel hiding the ledger not for one girl's comfort alone, but because he refused to let a town remain bent around a lie. So the first paper she signed as heir was not a sale order or personal withdrawal. It was a remission of overdue household water charges for widows, laborers, and small holders under the Upper Ditch. The second returned the Lower Market sheds to public lease at fair rates. The third rechartered the forge and foundry yard as Greer and Common Works, a cooperative repair and supply yard where townsfolk could have tools mended, wagon parts made, and ditch hardware forged without Brandt's toll standing between need and utility. The transformation did not come in one shining stroke. Restoration almost never does. It came by hammer and bucket, ledger and broom. Men repaired the forge roof under Hattie's direction, taking instruction from the very girl they had laughed at weeks earlier, and doing so with a seriousness that was its own apology. Mrs. Salazar and Mrs. Treadwell scrubbed the back room until soot gave up enough to let sunlight settle there honestly. Miss Hale donated shelves and schoolbooks so one corner of the office could serve children after lessons. Pastor Webb organized a workday to clear brush from the ditch banks. Old Mr. Dobbs hauled in a used stove. Hattie hired 2 widows to keep accounts and inventory because she knew what it meant to need dignified work more than sympathy. By winter, the forgotten forge had become once more the warm hinge of Cedar Ridge, not grand, not polished, but alive with useful noise. Sparks lifted in evening light. Hooves rang on the threshold. The bellows, repaired with fresh leather cut from a freight tarp and stitched by steady hands, breathed again. As for Silas Brandt, his justice arrived in the Western manner, without spectacle, without pity, and with a thoroughness no shouting could have improved. The court ordered repayment of water tolls improperly collected on parcels not his to tax. Creditors, scenting weakness where once they had smelled certainty, called in his own notes. The mercantile survived, but passed under partial receivership. The grand house on the hill had to be let. More painful than any of that, perhaps, was the quiet revision of posture around town. Men who once doffed hats first now nodded only when politeness required it. Women who had stood in his store measuring flour with lowered eyes filled pails at the reopened common tap without asking his leave. He was not driven out overnight. He remained long enough to witness daily the thing he had most despised, authority transferring not to a richer man, nor a harder one, but to the young woman he had expected hunger to train into obedience. In the spring he sold what remained of his interest and left for Denver. The day his wagon rolled past the forge, Hattie happened to be striking a red bar true on the anvil while a boy worked the bellows behind her. She did not stop or look up. That, more than any speech, was the measure of the world set right. With the estate stabilized, Hattie did one more thing that made Cedar Ridge love her in the durable way towns reserved for those who use power without vanity. She reopened the upper room in the old market shed as a night school for bookkeeping, penmanship, and practical mechanics, so daughters as well as sons could learn the numbers and measurements by which other people had so often ruled them. If paper can steal a roof, she told Miss Hale, paper ought also to help keep one. Children came first, then widowers wanting to read contracts for themselves, then 2 ranch wives, then a Mexican teamster with elegant hands who wished to improve his English script. The forge office lamp burned later than anyone remembered it ever doing under Ansel. Some evenings Hattie would look up from accounts and see through the smoke-soft glass the whole of Cedar Ridge arranged in living layers, the repaired ditch carrying water where it should, the market yard busy with barter, the school books open, the anvil steady, the night honest around them. There was inheritance in money. Yes, though less than rumor later claimed, but the real inheritance was shape. Hattie had been given, by a dead blacksmith's loyalty and a dying man's belated repentance, the chance to decide what authority in Cedar Ridge would feel like after greed loosened its grip. She made it feel plain. Fees were posted openly. Deeds were copied twice and stored apart. Widows paid after harvest. No one was evicted in winter. The common tap remained common. The forge door stayed unlatched from dawn until lamplight unless weather forced otherwise. When travelers came through thin and road stiff, They could warm hands by the stove and fill a cup without accounting for themselves. In this too, though Hattie did not say it aloud often, she honored the life she had just survived. Homelessness had taught her not merely fear but architecture. She knew exactly what kind of threshold ought not disappear from a town that wanted to call itself decent. And so, as years settled over the Red Hills and Cedar Ridge learned again how to speak of tomorrow without apology, people kept telling the story first as a wonder, and later as a truth so well worn it sounded almost inevitable. They said she had found a leather ledger behind the bellows. They said it named the true heir. Both things were true, but neither alone was large enough to hold what really happened there. The ledger did not save Cedar Ridge by magic. It saved the town because a young woman already shaped by labor, restraint, memory, and a fierce sense of fairness chose to believe the hidden page deserved daylight, and then had the stamina to carry that daylight into rooms built to keep it out. Plenty of people had passed the forgotten forge after Ansel died. Plenty had seen only a leaning roof, soot, waste, and old taxes. Hattie saw shelter first, then structure, then evidence, and finally obligation. That sequence mattered. It was the sequence by which worn things become useful again, and frightened communities become honorable once more. We began with a girl of 20, cast out, mocked, and left to spend almost the last of her money on a building everyone else had finished dismissing. Let us end there too, because beginnings reveal their meaning only after the middle has done its hard work. They mocked her for buying the forgotten forge, because mockery is often the easiest language available to people who are afraid hope might prove them small. They called the place dead, though inside its walls memory had not died at all. They believed a homeless woman could inherit inconvenience, dust, and rumor, but not standing, not title, not the authority to decide what justice should look like once it finally arrived. Yet behind the bellows, where breath should have lived and had not for years, a leather ledger waited with her name and her mother's name, and the true shape of Cedar Ridge folded into its soot-dark pages. Hattie Greer did not become worthy because that ledger named her. The ledger named her because, long before she opened it, she had already become the kind of person Ansel Doane trusted the truth to find. In the end, that was the deeper inheritance. Not land, not ditch shares, not warehouses or accounts, but the chance to prove that overlooked things and overlooked people can still carry the weight of a whole town back toward dignity if someone finally stops laughing long enough to listen. Thank you for spending this time with us in Cedar Ridge and with Hattie Greer. If her story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs a quiet reminder that ruin and worth are not the same thing, and that some of the truest names in our lives are the ones nearly hidden from view. Before you go, tell us this: when have you found lasting value in something other people had already written off? Until next time, stay close.